Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hollis Mickey, the Chief Learning and Access Officer at the Anchorage Museum, and I'm so thrilled to be able to welcome you into this important Rasmussen Foundation sponsored conversation considering cultural appropriation. This afternoon's conversation with our panelists will last 1 hour with a hard stop at 1:15. Before I introduce our moderator, I'd like us to each take a moment for land acknowledgement, wherever you might be listening or watching from. I'd like you to take a moment to find your body grounded in the space where you are. Perhaps you connect your feet with the floor. Envision the earth that supports the structure that you're in. And take a moment to honor and acknowledge the Indigenous stewards of your place, the place where you are. I am an uninvited guest on the homelands of the Eklutna people. They have stewarded these lands for thousands of years. You might share in the chat where you're watching or listening from and whose lands you are on. Thank you so much for that moment. I'd like now to introduce our moderator, Alice Glenn, who's going to share a little bit about herself and then invite our panelists to introduce themselves. One quick housekeeping note, if you have a question during the duration of this panel, I'll be monitoring the chat, but I'd request that you put it in the Ask a Question function, which you'll see at the lower bar of your screen. There we can accumulate all of the questions as they come in, and there'll be time to address some of them at the end. Thank you so much. And Alice, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Hollis. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Uvanga Qannik. I'm Alice Qannik Glenn. I am the host and producer of the Coffee and Clock podcast. Sorry, I'm hearing a little bit of an echo. See how I can figure it. Maybe earphones, but thank you all for being here today. Like I was saying, Savaktunga Kupiarlu Kwalu, I now work full-time on my podcast titled Coffee and Kwak. Coffee to represent keeping us woke, and Kwak to represent examining our topics through an Alaska Native lens. Kwak is the Inupiaq word for frozen or raw meat or fish. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank the Anchorage Museum for hosting Qannik, and then also Rasmussen Foundation for making this happen today. So with that, I'd like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves one by one, and maybe we can start with Melissa.
All right. Willie Jan and Sarote, Melissa Shaginoff sa Setlan, Yudishiot Koya Kara Etlan, na itini Ana Kayak Sinsiaran, artist and curator Gogashna, Chinan Kotan was at the Otlan. It's good to see all of you and, know that we have some people listening in. Thank you so much, Alice, for inviting me here today and moderating this conversation. So my name is Melissa. I'm Caribou and Fish Eater Clan from Chickaloon Village, and I'm an artist and curator, and it's me. How about to EJ?
Hey, everybody. Good to see you again, Melissa and Alice. Good to meet you online, Sonia. Thank you to the Rasmussen Foundation. Thank you to Hollis. Thank you to the Anchorage Museum for inviting us and hosting this. For those of you who are watching and or listening, my name is EJ David. I am an immigrant from the Philippines, and although I identify as Filipino, as it is what is most familiar to people, the term Filipino really is a colonial name. The peoples in the lands now known as the Philippines are very diverse. There are many ethnic and cultural groups throughout the islands. My ancestors are Kapampangan and Tagalog. They are people of the riverbanks and people of the river. So it is my Kapampangan and Tagalog ancestors who I must remember today, and it is them who are with me here today. I also must acknowledge my family. My wife is Koyukon Athabaskan from the village of Ruby by the Yukon River. Together we have 4 children. malakas, kalayaan, kaluguran, and tala. And even though you don't see them with me here physically, they're always with me, just like my ancestors. I am a reflection of them, just like I am a reflection of my ancestors. And then finally, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you all from the lands of the Dinaina people, the Gayakak, otherwise known as Anchorage. It is here where I live and work at the University of Alaska Anchorage as a professor of psychology. Good to be here. Sonia?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sonia Guinañsaca. Alice, thank you so much for opening up the space. And EJ and Melissa, just super excited to share this virtual space. I'm joining everyone, all of you from Tongva land, also known as Los Angeles. And myself, I am Quichua Cañari from Ecuador. And just my background is in doing a lot of community organizing, specifically with undocumented migrant communities. And then over the years, shifted over to doing cultural organizing, specifically focusing on building ecosystem for Black, Indigenous, people of color, artists, and cultural workers. And so super excited to be here with you all. And you may hear my dogs in the background, but this is, technology and pandemic time. So once again, really appreciate the space there we're carving out today.
Yay. Well, thank you all for taking the time to hang out today. I know you must be super busy. And yeah, it is getting a little frustrating to just meet online all the time and being in front of a screen. But I'm so happy to see all of your faces. I also want to introduce the IAA program from Rasmussen Foundation. If you don't know, the Rasmussen Foundation has an individual artist awards program. It's there to help support artists in Alaska. So you can probably visit on their website. And that is the first time that I have ever been introduced to the concept of cultural appropriation. I used to work at Rasmussen Foundation as a fellow in the programs department. And that is kind of what prompted me to do a podcast episode about cultural appropriation. Sorry, I'm having a echo and it's throwing me off because I'm hearing myself speak.
You might try refreshing your browser page, Alice. So if you just hit refresh, it'll make you kind of pop away for a moment, but it might help with the echo.
Okay, let me try.
Yeah.
I'm back. Okay.
Is that better?
A little bit.
It's better for us. The echo is gone on our end now.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So back to our conversation. Thank you all for making the time to talk about cultural. Maybe I can just take these off, Eddie. The first time, so I wanted to ask you all personally, the first time you either encountered the concept of cultural appropriation or the term cultural appropriation, because I know that when I used to work at Rasmussen Foundation, it was just, I hadn't really thought about it in any way or in any technical term before. And it was interesting to me. And I was like, oh, wow, this is kind of, it felt like very familiar, but now that there was a term for it. So please, can you all share a little bit about maybe the first time you've heard of the concept of cultural appropriation or the term? And we can start with Melissa.
Yeah, it's hard for me to kind of pinpoint when I first heard the term. I think that I first heard the term when I would listen to people trying to sort of justify cultural appreciation as cultural appropriation. And I think that that's always kind of interesting. People are saying, what's appropriation versus appreciation? And I think it's a lot simpler than people always want to say it's complex, but I think it's actually pretty pretty simple. It's like, if you are benefiting in any way, in capital or even social capital, you're appropriating something, and if you are changing the sort of narrative that it takes for someone to be able to, or if you're challenging the narrative for someone to be able to tell their own story, I think that you have to, look at it as cultural appropriation, and so I can't really pinpoint when I've first heard it. I've just been in the art world. I think I've heard it a lot, in people trying to justify, those things, kind of like the concept of like, there's no new ideas, and, those kind of like one-liner tropes. But yeah, I think that, that cultural appropriation is something that, particularly in Alaska, we see a lot of, and I mean, you see a lot of just within this country, anyways, yeah.
Thanks, Melissa. Maybe Sonia?
Yeah, same as Melissa. I don't think there's like a particular moment that I can go back in time. I think that growing up, I maybe didn't have the language or the framework to name exactly what it is. And so maybe it's a terminology that came further along in college. But I knew as a young person, as this like young individual, just seeing this inappropriate or like very achy and tender usage of a certain type of item of clothing from my community being used and then framed in a way that it was like kind of celebration. And so I think I want to say like the actual like framework of like cultural appropriation didn't come until like later in college, like more in a theory way, but that experience, that like firsthand experience of like cultural appropriation was like there from the very beginning. And so, yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think similarly, I can't really pinpoint a time in my life when I first kind of felt cultural appropriation. But I remember, I think one of the earliest times I heard the term and began to understand what it was when, as an immigrant to this country, as a, person from a colonized place, we saw a lot of mainstream American pop culture, right? And so I grew up in the Philippines where everybody loved Elvis Presley, and he's king, right? And then I moved to this country, and Elvis Presley is king here too. And then and then I started hearing people talking about how Elvis Presley really stole a lot of music, a lot of Black music. And people started using the term cultural appropriation from that, and how Elvis benefited from it and became, very famous and very wealthy because of that. And so that's really when I first heard of the term cultural appropriation, and I had a clear example of what it is. So that's the moment for me. But then that also kind of made me realize how much I didn't know, like how much colonialism and just oppression in general kind of erased things and distorted history and distorted reality for me and for many people like me, that I didn't even know that. I didn't even know Elvis stole music from Black people. You know what I mean? And there I was, and millions of other people like me celebrating him and idolizing him and throwing our money to him. You know what I'm saying? So yeah. So I think that was the clearest example of cultural appropriation for me, one of the earliest ones at least.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, we kind of spoke a little bit about it already, but let's just jump right in, like what would you say is the difference between, cultural appropriation or cultural inspiration or appreciation?
I mean, I think it's hard to sort of like mince words, so I just won't. A cultural appropriation is stealing. It's stealing of ideas and cultural identity, and I kind of hear this, that not one person can own culture. I was like, well, then that also means that you can't be taking from something that is someone's specific experiences and cherry picking and deciding what sort of things that you like about it, without taking that whole experience, right? Because you have cultural appropriation, to EJ's example, that Elvis Presley, someone like that, who is appropriating, who is like stealing content and inspiration and brilliance, from Black musicians. It's not only money capital, but it's social capital as to who Elvis is, right? I think appreciation and inspiration, I think the only way that can exist and live is in like direct support. So you're purchasing art from a person of color, you're purchasing art from somebody. That's appreciation and inspiration to me. And you're making it a point that every time you wear those earrings, or every time you wear that cuspbuck, that you're signaling back when somebody compliments you on them, or mentions it to you, that you're saying, oh, this artist made those things. That's appreciation, inspiration to me. I don't think that it should be anything, kind of like used as content to be creating your own version of it. I think that's like really kind of like skirting the lines on the sort of appropriateness of what you're doing. And for me, it's like I draw very hard lines. Some people try to draw a little bit softer lines, but there's so many talks out like this. EJ and I think have been on 2 together about cultural appropriation. So it's like there's a lot of content out there that's telling you sort of what is appropriation, what is inspiration, but you really need to be doing your own research and work to be finding those things. And attending a talk like this is one of them. But I just think that there's a lot of information out there like that, and it's not as complex as we may try to intellectualize it.
Melissa, you said it perfectly. I think it's just like at the core of it is like cultural appropriation is a harm that you're doing, is an unconsensual misappropriation. This like stealing. There's like I tend to say like there's like fine line of appreciation. It's not like what you can do is move back, like a way to support individual communities, individual artists from a culture that you may not be part of, is by supporting, whether it's like monetarily. We live in a digital world now as well, where we can also like uplift and share links and share these artists and cultural workers, and I think that it doesn't have to be that complicated to understand that if you're causing harm, if you are the cultural appropriation, it is about harm, and it is about stepping into a space and really just not being thoughtful and intentional. And I know like this is an area of growth for many artists and cultural workers, but we must do better. And I think that like having these conversations right now, like there's so many multiple conversations around cultural appropriation, but at the bottom of it is like, as an artist, as a cultural worker, if you're not from community, can you reflect on your own stance of like what calls you to make that specific art, piece, a cultural piece? What is your relationship to it? What is it is like it for many artists and cultural workers who create anything. And if you're not part from that community, you are gaining cultural capital, you are gaining monetary, you are gaining so much benefits. And so like, how is that a sustainable practice? Is that a reciprocal practice with the community that you're, calling in through your art making? And so, like Melissa, I just wanted to like build from what you were saying, which is like, it's simple. We don't have to simplify it or make it more or maybe too complicated, but it is an act of like, what is the harm that you may be doing, and how unconsensuous that is, and what is your intentionality and your responsibility as an artist and cultural worker.
Yeah, just to add on to what's been said, I don't want to repeat anything because it's been said beautifully already. But just to add on to that, it's also important for people to understand that what they might be appropriating, whether that be some form of art or language or ceremony or ritual, whatever it might be that they might be appropriating, they need to remember the historical reality that the people who own that culture and that ritual and that language and that ceremony were historically oppressed and killed and marginalized for practicing it, and now you're benefiting from it and you're getting rich off of it. I mean, just to realize that fact, I think will be a big help already for your own. I hope it helps how you then move forward, because it really should tell you, should make you realize, should make you realize, at least help make you realize the privileged position that you might be in. If you're benefiting from things that other people used to be killed for. So I think that's one important critical piece that I hope people consider.
Right. So I think that this idea of cultural appropriation can manifest in several different ways, right? And I wasn't even really fully aware of all of the different kinds of ways that it can manifest. So can you all please just mention a few ways or ways that you have seen in your own life how cultural appropriation has manifested?
Well, I just wanted to make a quick comment too on what EJ was saying about kind of that, like if you're benefiting, off something that people were, marginalized and oppressed, and it's like incredibly a tone deaf thing to be, if somebody was unable to sort of, be their full selves within their culture, and yet you get to cherry pick it, and because you're not part of that culture, be able to represent it. I think, like, for me, that's the way it manifests, right? Is that, I gave a talk once about cultural appropriation as kind of like an act of violence, because it is an act of like continual violence, for somebody who has not been able to fully express themselves, through their families, through themselves, but yet somebody who's not part of that culture can cherry pick, and without the experience, without the pain, get to represent that thing, and I think that that's the way it sort of manifests in the art world, and I think specifically like within like the Rasmussen and the Anchorage Museum, and like things that, myself, like as an artist, like I will apply to certain things. And, I'd say that, I may apply to do some language work, or apply to do some sort of community work. But if I have somebody who before me, because of their privilege, has had access to those spaces, prior to my access to them, and they've appropriated my culture that I'm trying to now represent, there's a confusion, in the memory of that institution of being like, okay, so, well, this person, did this version of this cultural thing, but now here I am trying to give that version from an experiential place. I think that cultural appropriation confuses the narrative. It confuses the institution. It confuses all the things that I'm like trying to put out in the world, my audience, the whatever sort of application I'm doing or show that I'm trying to propose. If somebody has tried to do that cultural thing from a cultural appropriative like standpoint, they aren't telling the whole story. So here I am coming in with the experiential story. The narrative is confused, and I have to convince, those institutional powers, those powers of which I'm trying to sort of pierce into, of my authenticity, And I think that's like a real harm, and that's something that many Indigenous people in Alaska and BIPOC people across this country have to experience, right? Because you have non-Indigenous people, you have people who are not BIPOC, who are trying to share a story that's not theirs. And so the narrative is confused. And I think that's where appropriation has like a real sort of like generational effect on people, because it makes it so the doors are continued to be closed to our experience and realness and the fullness of those cultural things that we're trying to bring into our work. Hopefully that wasn't too, I hope that made sense.
I think some examples for me have been specifically like zooming in into like arts and cultural spaces. When I've moved into a space, let's say a exhibition of some visual pieces, and I'm like, whoa, this is incredible, and then I get to the bio and I'm like, what, how did we arrive to this moment of storytelling that may not be from that community? And so it's like the additional work of like, okay, let me not jump to conclusions. So I do my research and realize that that person, that artist, may not have a connection to the community. And then things make a little bit more sense when it becomes very romanticized in a particular way, or very singular and very aesthetics and very one layered of set story, right? And so I think those moments are very alarming, because majority of the time when we're thinking about Black, Indigenous, people of color, artist makers and cultural, bearers and culture makers, we're already moving from a space that the ecosystem is so fractured in supporting these artists and cultural workers. And so when we have folks who are coming and extracting stories and extracting narratives, and getting the support, whether it's like grants or funding or even like a gallery space, it is I'm always like wondering like what was the vision for that artist to create the piece, because it is not nourishing back the community. It is not in relation to the community. And so I think that's a good example for me. And another thing that reminded me of is also, Alice, you sent some questions about like when it comes to language or cultural revitalization. And for me, I was trying to learn Quechua. I came to, into the United States when I was 5 years old. And so I was trying to learn Quechua in New York. I walk into a space and it was a white person who had the accreditations from a university and who was trying to teach it back to me. And in a way I was like, okay, I can see where this is going. But I also saw the privilege and the position of power that this person is coming with, and the way that this person was not working with community, that it was very harmful space. It's a very traumatic space. It wasn't thought thoughtfully. And so just like thinking about what is like our frameworks and approaches when we're here supposedly supporting other communities that we may not be part of. Like, what is the intention? What is like the values that you're sharing? Is there permission? Did you even ask folks? There's always this misguided things like, I want to help and I want to support uplifting these stories, but said communities may already be doing so, and maybe you're just not cued in because you're not part of community. And so just like, I think all of that are some examples that I can bring in and can add to this conversation. But I'm like open to hear from EJ too.
Yeah, I mean, again, I just want to add on to what's been said. For me, there are, those obvious manifestations of it. Those clear-cut, blatant examples of cultural appropriation. But what I want to bring in right now are, like two examples of. I mean, in my mind, they're still clear-cut examples, but I think it kind of, for many folks, as Melissa, I think alluded to earlier, for many folks, it kind of like complicates things a little bit. And those two examples are like people who are well-intentioned, right? So once you bring in intention, right? Look, I'm well-intentioned, I'm trying to help, I'm trying to uplift the community, I'm trying to help with the revitalization of the community and so on. So that I kind of want to bring that example in, because I do see a lot of that too. And maybe they are very well-intentioned, right? And so maybe that's a conversation that we can have is should intention be a critical part of that, of cultural appropriation? Does that even matter? Because many people will say that, right? Well, I'm well-intentioned, right? And then, so then that kind of like borders into like, this kind of white savior kind of thing, complex. And then the other example that I want to bring in too is, people who are, who are appropriating for their own spiritual wellness, or just for their own personal wellness, I guess. So because I see a lot of that too, right? And so then, as a, I work in psychology, and I'm all for that. I love people when they become well, when they become healthy, and if it's benefiting them, if it's, if they're helping them, rise up out of addiction or rise up out of whatever issues they might be facing in their life, then to me, that's good to see. But then it puts me in this really difficult position. Like, I'm glad to see them getting healthy, but then at the same time, I'm like, well, but why are you using somebody else's culture and cultural ways and practices and ceremonies, to bring you back out of that? You know what I mean? So that's the other thing that I see a lot of is, and then, I question myself, like, well, who am I to say don't do that? I mean, I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad you're healthy. You know what I mean? So I don't know. So that's, to me, that's this, I see that a lot. And that's also the, like a difficult position that I find myself often in. Yeah. So those are the two manifestations that I want to bring into our conversation today.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, EJ, because I remember we were having a conversation. There was a story in the news about, somebody who was helping to revitalize some sort of practice in one of the villages down south in like the southeast or whatever. I don't remember what maybe weaving or something. But it was a non-native person helping with revitalization movements, and kind of bringing that practice back. And it was like, well, is this cultural appropriation, or is this, something positive? We talk about intention, maybe they're well-intentioned. Like what do you all think about that? Because, it could be hard to draw the line. Sometimes in my head, I'm like, okay, well, I get it from this point of view, but I also understand it from this point of view. Like, what do you all think about this idea? Because there are many different cultural groups in the process of revitalizing practices and traditions and, life ways, I guess you could say. And would that be something you would consider cultural appropriation, or are there exceptions?
I think that it's interesting, right? Because you kind of get into kind of like the savior complex too, that it just inherently kind of involves, right? Because you have, a non-native person, a white person, coming in and, helping revitalize the culture, and, it goes into a lot of questions for me. It's like, well, what sort of, Sonia mentioned consent a lot, what sort of consent has been given? What sort of like blessing has been given? What ways are they benefiting? I mean, they're benefiting from, an article being written about them, is it that they're kind of like they're being sort of like lifted up as this ally who's helping revitalize something, and it's kind of like, it's like you have to look at it from all perspectives of being, well, then what was the state of that thing before this white person came in to revitalize it? It's like, I wonder what the truth is about, if they know it, then someone else obviously taught them, So I think that it's just kind of like, well, what's the whole story? Because it seems like the story is much more centered on this non-native person, saving a part of someone's culture. And so it's like it's very complex, and I think that I know that in the beginning I said that it's simple, but I think that there's simple questions that you can ask, those in those situations to kind of get at, what's the true story, and I think that in so many ways it's all contextual, it's based on a lot of like the context of that experience, and what's available. And I think communities have to sort of like make those decisions. And it's difficult to come to community decisions because Western culture has subjugated us, where we don't make community decisions in a way where we have many voices heard, right? And that's just kind of like any sort of that's like any part of Western culture is our decisions have been made subjugated where not as many people are heard as like in more. I'm just speaking from my indigenous culture where decisions were made in a more communal basis, across clans. It's like you have to be transparent about your intention and your benefits, and I think that instances like that have to be contextual, and those simple questions have to be asked at every direction of it. Not to say that whatever that person was doing wasn't benefiting their students. It probably was, but then also where was the breakdown between those people being able to learn from their elders, and why do we have to have a white intermediary to transmit that knowledge? Those are the questions you have to ask, I think.
Yeah, and in the same capacity of, I think is like self-screening. If you're that ally, if you're like watching this and and you're thinking of like, what is my role? I'm trying to support, or may have good intentions, or valid reasons, there's a deeper connection, but I think it's like a part of like self-screening, like what is your position of privilege, what am I receiving, even if that's not something that I want. Maybe it's not monetary or the cultural capital or the accreditations or the visibility, but inadvertently you will be receiving that because we live in a white supremacist world, and so like what are the opportunities for you to move back? Is there a timeline here where you can say, what, here are the skill sets and the tools that I may have, and I may be moving into the space with these resources that I can provide, and then I will transition out. I am invested in community, the leadership of the community, and the knowledge transferring that I may have acquired because of whatever practices, but now I can transition out of that. I think there's like longer term self-screening as an ally, in terms of your connection or relation to a certain cultural practice is very important. And yeah, I think that specifically is more for allies, like if you're watching this.
Yeah, just real quick too to add on to that, is to, I think it's important to step back, and listen. If people, from the community that you may be appropriating from are calling you out or criticizing you or maybe calling you in even, to have some humility and, as been shared already, do like constant self-reflection, and just listen to the community, instead of doubling down on what it is that you're doing and continuing to make the same mistakes and justifying where you are and defending where you are. Listen, and then I think Sonia mentioned it several times already too. I think relationships with the community is important. There's consent, there's relationship. How deep is that relationship? I think that can go a long way as well. And I think that touches on what Melissa said earlier too, about what kind of, some of the questions that you can ask, right? To kind of determine like, how deep is this relationship that you have with the community that you might be appropriating from. So there are those questions that I think people need to ask themselves instead of, waiting for others, to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad that you said that, EJ, that like about calling people in, and I think that like a good way for anybody who is, I think questioning whether or not what they're doing is appropriative, is to set yourself up to be ready for correction. So when you start to ask even yourself those questions, I think if you're setting yourself up as like being in a learning space, nobody's trying to, well, not, I can't say nobody, but, I think the majority of us are not trying to enact cultural violence on anyone. And maybe that's the optimist in me. But at the same time, I think that if you sort of approach it as that you're willing to be corrected, that you're willing to sort of accept those answers and do that work, I think that we're all, that this kind of change is not linear, that it's circular, and so, yeah, that you have to be ready for more of a holistic approach to writing those things and making those decisions as you move forward.
Yeah. Thank you for that response. And I think that, I'd like to play a little bit of devil's advocate sometimes. And, I think some of the arguments that I've seen is that this idea of cultural appropriation can be stifling for art. We live like in a globalized world now, and we have access to the internet, and we have, a lot of established relationships and everything. So, I mean, what would you guys say to someone who says that, cultural appropriation could be stifling for the art community?
I can go first on this one, I guess. To me, what's stifling is oppression, historical and contemporary oppression. And if, in everything that you said, devil, I'm talking to the devil here because that was coming from the devil. Everything that you said is true, that we are living in a more interconnected world, with technology and globalization and everything. And there's inevitably going to be intercultural contact and intercultural exchange and all of that. That's true. But also what's true and also what's real is that there's power inequalities between different peoples and between different cultures, right? And so you have to live with those two realities together. Like you cannot just accept one reality that yes, we are all connected, and then ignore the reality that there are power inequalities happening and that there's active oppression that happened historically and are still happening contemporarily. So you have to incorporate those two realities together, right? And so to me, yes, intercultural exchange, intercultural contact, those are all great and beautiful things, right? But the reality is also that those things don't happen in a vacuum. Those things don't happen, with all groups of people on equal status. And so, I think power and oppression is a critical piece that we need to take into consideration. So just because we are talking about cultural appropriation, and power and oppression is a big part of that, does not mean that we are not open to intercultural contact or intercultural exchange, or we're not. I mean, those things can happen while also still thinking about the reality that oppression happened and is still actively happening. Yeah.
I would also add, like, for whom is like zooming into cultural appropriation, like stifling in the arts and cultural world, like if that's stifling for someone, the arts and cultural world, like funding from galleries to like resources have served like for a very long time, like white artists and white culture makers. And there is no stifling that there at this moment right now. Majority of the funding, majority of like institutional cultural institutional spaces, like represented, are in leadership by like white men. I'm forgetting what the report was, but white men under 30 are the group that currently is able to have a self-sustaining art practice. And so if we're thinking about like, if we're like coming down on cultural appropriation and and impeding on the expansion of arts and culture the world, that is not like, I think that the focus should be like reshifting from worrying about the cause it may have in the arts and culture for these like these people who have already had the privilege of making art making process, from appropriating, rather shifting it over and placing more conversation and resources and funding into Black, Indigenous, people of color artists and culture makers, right? Like, I'm interested in like what are the ecosystems and what are the structures in place that where they're supported, where they're making art, and getting nourished, and communities are thriving, and many, however we want to define thriving, versus like focusing on like, like the arts and cultural world might like miss out on cultural or art pieces because we're like cracking down on cultural appropriation. I think that it's a very like, yeah, like a misguided conversation to have. Yeah.
Well, and just kind of like an uninformed argument too, right? I mean, divorcing yourself from cultural appropriation because you find it stifling, and that's your argument. Like, it's just not a good argument. It's you can't. I mean, I think it's James Baldwin who says, talks about the artist, and that it's very difficult to divorce yourself from the context of what's happening in the world. And as an artist, as someone who's meant to be sort of assessing the world and responding to it, like you're not allowed to be, you're just not, it's not, there's no way that you cannot not be part of it. You're part of it. You're part of that context, and you're an extension of like the continued privilege. If you're a white person, or a non-Indigenous person, a non-BIPOC person, if you can't separate yourself from the privilege that you receive just inherently by that. So if you're, it's just, you can't just separate yourself. You can't just say it's stifling and that be your argument. It negates every other person's experience, and just continuing to be oppressive, as EJ said, so anyways.
Thank you. So how, before we go into a Q&A, I just have one more question that I've prepared. And I'd also like to open it up to you all as well, if you'd like to either mention something that you think is super important or ask each other a question. But here's my last one, and it's, how can we best inform and educate each other about cultural appropriation?
I can take a stab at this. I think for myself, when I'm in conversation with other culture makers, or like arts and cultural spaces, or philanthropic spaces, one of the things I always say is like, let's, the tools that we may have in place right now, or the systems in place, or the infrastructure that we may have in place, it can always be better. And so how do we bring in better tools or better approaches to this? How do we reassess maybe some of the ways that we like to, think of artists or culture makers for a very long time. And it still happens now, like the way that we mainstream culture, or however we may describe it, really uplifts this idea of the artist by themselves, because like brilliant genius individual person. And so when we've reshifted to community, there's this conversation that opens up and invokes and invites of like, what is our relationship with community? What is our, our practices? How can we be transparent? When I'm in conversation with other artists and cultural workers, I'm like, yeah, what's your art making process? Like, who's there? Who comes with you in the room? What was your intention? And so having that kind of transparent conversation, intentional conversation, opens up space for people to, to be genuine and very and share how they are arriving, and that might end up being that they are cultural appropriating something. And so then there's that space to have that conversation. I also like invite like a transformative justice lens, which is like, we may cause harm to each other. At some point in our lives, we may cause harm to other people. And so what is the least harm that we can do in our practice? What is our approaches? What is our value placements? What can we do? And so coming from that lens, then that opens up to like other fellow artists and cultural workers to reassess their work, because our art world does not teach artists to think about their practice or their community making. Rather, it pushes us to be in competition, or to be extractive, or to be, about the accreditations, for whatever, And so I think that's the way of having those conversations with other folks.
I just want to say there's so many resources online. There's so many flow charts. There's so many discussions. This one will also be, available to be streamed and listened to again, but that I think that in many ways, like most sort of like socio-cultural issues that have to do with BIPOC people, is that, you have to do your own research. You have to go try to find conversations like this, because in my art history 101 class in college, it certainly appropriation wasn't mentioned or talked about, and I think that that we need to start like bringing, as people who are cultural makers, as artists, as educators, that we need to start bringing that in and having the conversation within institutions, within education as well, and that, that we can continue to sort of like push the narrative that, that BIPOC people can represent themselves and represents their experience and represents their culture, that we really don't need anyone. We don't need a savior. We don't need allies to be representing our culture back to us, and that we're truly the best ones to tell that story. The best ones, and also the only ones who can tell that story, because it comes from a really authentic place, So I think that, I mean, by those rules, it leaves a very shallow margin for where it's appropriate, and appreciative. But I think that's okay, And if you just start to acknowledge that and ask yourself those questions, and again, there's a million resources online, so. And I'd say too that everyone listening here today, that's part of your responsibility, is like you're here listening and hearing, if you're a person of privilege, whether you have, white privilege, or you have privilege like in your socioeconomic status, you have privilege as an artist, as an educator. It's part of your responsibility, right? As culture makers, because we all make our own culture. That we bring these things that we learn into our daily lives, into when we see, somebody who, is being oppressed. That's how community change happens, and that's what I want to just task everyone listening here today, that when you see appropriative things happen, that you call it out, and with whatever privilege you have, to help teach and help spread that information. So it's not always on, the four people of color in the room, to teach everyone, because it's truly a community thing. If you want to be supportive of Indigenous and BIPOC communities, then help us tell this story.
Yeah, and just real quick, and I'm not sure if this is appropriate, or I don't know what the word is, appropriate, ironic, I don't know, poetic justice. I don't know. But I'm going to use a quote from probably one of the best, or not one of the best, but one of the most popular cultural appropriators there ever was, Vanilla Ice. And I want to say, stop, collaborate, and listen. I think those are very important, like easy to remember things. Like, stop your standard operating procedures, whatever that might be, for your own personal standard operating procedures or your organization's standard operating procedures, what that might be. Stop, reflect on it, right? Interrogate it, critique it. Just because you've been doing it the same way for years doesn't mean it's the right way to do it, right? Be open to new ways of doing things. And then collaborate, right? Collaborate with the community that you claim to be inspiring you, the community that you claim to be, helping you and that you're getting inspiration from, right? Collaborate with them, build relationships with them, right? And then also listen, listen to them. Listen to them if they're telling you that you're doing something wrong. Listen to them if they're telling you that you're making a mistake. So I think those three words, stop, collaborate, and listen, can be a good, guideline for many people. And then once you know better, and I'm not going to end with a Vanilla Ice quote. I'm going to end with a Maya Angelou quote, right? Once you do better, right? Once people have told you, educated you, informed you, called you in, once you know better, do better, right? So that's, what Maya Angelou said. It's not a guarantee that you're never going to make a mistake again, but again, rinse, repeat, and recycle, I guess. Go through the loop again. Stop, collaborate, listen, and then once you know better, do better. If you make a mistake, stop, collaborate, listen. Once you know better, do better. My baby's crying now. She's calling for me.
Oh, I'm just gonna vocally pop in. This is Hollis from the Anchorage Museum. We're right at 1:15, which I know we'd said was our hard stop. We can maybe kind of close shortly. I do think that actually the questions that are in the Ask a Question function, many of them have been addressed in one way or another. In maybe not exactly, but a little bit with some good thoughts. I think EJ's last comments about that cycle really address some of the questions and are a good way to maybe encounter that, some of these things that have come up in that Q&A. But I just wanted to I think one of the ones that maybe hasn't been as addressed is just maybe how this can be quite personal. Maybe if you are someone who has been marginalized, how do you manage a moment where you might be encountering someone who is maybe expressing appreciation in quotes for your culture, but it's being done in a way that is harmful to you in that moment, and how might you address that for yourself, and maybe any wisdom or guidance you might be able to offer.
Hollis, do you mean how might a culture bearer approach that, or how might the artist who may be appropriating somebody's
sorry, I wasn't being clear. I was thinking about that question about fetishism, and thinking a little bit about how if you are receiving something that is couched as appreciation for your work, and perhaps is perceived by the person who is of dominant culture as such, but is not. It is, and it is harmful to you in the moment in the way that it is being presented. How to navigate that scenario, or do you have guidance about how to do that? I don't know if that's more clear. How might you respond to someone maybe who's appreciating, and in quotes, right? But it is really fetishizing or really demeaning or reductionist in its approach.
I always try to direct people to resources. I think that I can, and I've had this experience before where it's like you can tell people only what they're really willing to hear, and willing to change. Many people are very defensive when this kind of like comes out, and I think that that's just like something that as makers, we have to foster in ourselves, like letting go of that defensiveness, particularly when we're doing things that are, that could be perceived as culturally appropriative, right? Is that we need to be open to hearing those things. And I say we, the greater we of like the artistic community. But yeah, it's like what I do is I try to just direct people to resources, as well as like give them sort of like what my take on it is, but in my experience, directing people to resources is kind of the best way, because it's also like enacting like, all right, here's the labor I have to do, again. And so, yeah, I think that if you're somebody who has like the foresight or not the foresight, but like the, can look at this in a more holistic perspective to try to educate yourself, on the topic. If somebody calls you out, if your sort of like response is like, all right, I need to look into this, and maybe try to check those defensive feelings. I think that that's a good way of going about it. If somebody mentions it to you, it's something that you should take heed of. I also think that it's not an easy thing for artists to anyone to tell you that this is potentially culturally appropriative. That's not an easy call out. And I think that you should honor that and give it the time that it deserves, which is a lot of bravery, actually.
Thank you. I feel like the other couple of questions have been covered in one way or another, and we are at time. I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to learn and be a part of this conversation today as a listener. And thank you to the Rasmussen Foundation for sponsoring this public conversation, Alice for your deft moderation, and to our panelists for your meaningful contributions. And I want to just say, of course, this conversation is not one that is that ends. We were talking about this at the beginning of the session before we went public, that this could be all day. So we hope that you continue to engage in your communities with the resources that are there, as you all have so meaningfully and inspiringly suggested. So thank you for your time, everyone. And for a housekeeping note for anyone listening and watching, this link will stay live, so you'll be able to use this link to share with others and rewatch this yourself as well. So thank you, everyone, for your time today.
Thank you.
Shanann, Anna.